Don't expect a cent from Dad's 92 million. That's what my son said the day after the funeral. I was still in black, still smelling the flowers from the grave. They didn't come to grieve. They came to claim. My grandson marked the furniture. My daughter-in-law talked about remodeling. My chair at the table was gone, replaced with a folding one in the laundry room. They laughed like I was already gone. But I stayed quiet, holding the paper in my pocket. Proof of what I built. Proof of what they erased. I didn't speak then, but I will now. Let me tell you what really happened. My name is Marjorie Harlow. I'm 73 years old, a widow, and for most of my life I was simply known as William's wife. I spent 50 years keeping our home together, raising our son, helping with the business when I could, staying quiet when people said that's what a good wife should do. I thought silence meant strength. I thought patience would be enough. It wasn't. The morning of the funeral, Savannah Bay was covered in a gray mist. The air smelled of lilacs and rain, heavy and clean, like the world had just been washed. People arrived early, old business partners, neighbors, friends I hadn't seen in decades. They all whispered the same things. He built an empire. He was a visionary. You must be proud. I nodded, smiled, said thank you. The polite answers people expect from a widow. But pride wasn't what I felt. What I felt was distance, like I was standing in the middle of my own life, but didn't belong there anymore. William's coffin was made of dark oak, polished smooth, his name carved in silver. I placed my hand on it, the way you touch something that used to be part of you. My fingers shook, but I didn't cry. Behind me, someone whispered, "She hasn't shed a tear. Maybe she doesn't feel anything." They were wrong. I'd cried all I could, quietly, alone, long before today. My son Edward stood near the priest. He looked every bit the proud heir, tall, composed, suit pressed to perfection. He shook hands, thanked donors, and spoke with confidence as if the day was his to manage. He wasn't grieving, he was performing. I recognized that face. Calm, ambitious, practiced. It was the same one his father used when talking to investors. When the priest began to speak, I barely listened. My mind was still in the hospital room, remembering William's hand in mine, cold but trying to hold on. "You always knew how to fix things," he whispered. Those were his last words. I didn't realize then how much truth they carried. After the burial, we moved to the reception tent near the garden. The ground was wet, and every step left a mark on the grass. I stood by the edge, watching people gather around Edward. They congratulated him. Yes, congratulated, for the legacy his father had left him. Someone said, "You'll do great things, just like him." Edward smiled, soaking it all in, already stepping into the spotlight that used to be his father's. I held a cup of weak coffee and stayed out of the way. That's what I was good at. Staying quiet, keeping peace. But as I watched my son raise a glass and say, "To Dad's empire," something inside me shifted. I thought of all the nights I'd stayed up balancing bills, of the jewelry I'd sold when the company nearly collapsed, of the meals I skipped so Edward could go to school wearing clean clothes. I thought of all the things I'd given so they could build that empire, and how easily they'd forgotten. When the last of the guests left, I started walking toward the car. Edward followed me halfway down the path. He looked calm, almost relieved. "Mom," he said, adjusting his tie, "don't expect a cent from Dad's 92 million. At first, I thought I misheard him. Maybe he meant something else. But he didn't. He said it slowly, clearly, like a line he'd rehearsed. There was no hesitation in his voice, no shame. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see my little boy. I saw a man who had already decided I was a burden. His wife, Vanessa, called from behind him, "We'll handle the rest, Mom. You can go home." She smiled like she was doing me a favor. So I did what they wanted. I walked away. I could still hear their laughter as I reached the car. The rain had started again, soft at first, then steady. I pulled out the small white handkerchief I'd carried since our wedding day. The letters WH were stitched in one corner, faded from years of washing. I squeezed it tight until my knuckles went white. It was the only piece of him that still felt real. I didn't cry. I didn't ask questions. Because deep down, I already knew. Grief doesn't just take away the person you love. It exposes everyone left standing around you. It shows you who still has a heart and who's already buried theirs. As I sat in the car, I told myself to breathe. I had been through worse. I knew how to fix things. He said so himself. And as I looked back through the rain-streaked window, I realized something. The initials on that handkerchief weren't just his. They were ours. William Harlow. And me, Marjorie Harlow. Whatever came next, I wasn't done. I still had the key. When we got back to Harlow Manor, the house didn't feel like mine anymore. The air was thick with perfume, laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. Someone had opened all the windows, letting in the salt wind from Savannah Bay. It mixed with the smell of wine and wet grass, washing away what was left of the funeral. They called it a celebration of life, but it felt more like a rehearsal dinner for greed. From the staircase, I could see everything. The crystal chandelier glowing too bright, the champagne bubbling in tall flutes, the sound of heels tapping across the marble floor. The house, my house, had become a showroom. My grandson Ethan ran across the living room holding a pack of neon sticky notes. He pressed them on anything he wanted: the grandfather clock, the china cabinet, the old piano where William once played on Sunday mornings. Each time he said the same words: "This one's mine." He said it with excitement, like a child claiming prizes at a carnival. His sister Megan followed behind him with her phone camera open. She was using an app that scanned the rooms. "We'll remodel this into a spa," she said to no one in particular. "Maybe put a small bar here. Better lighting, definitely." I watched them both. They didn't lower their voices, they didn't look ashamed. Every object they touched had a memory. The rocking chair where I nursed Edward when he had the flu, the sideboard where William used to leave little notes before going to work, the grandfather clock that once marked our anniversaries with its chime. Now they were all covered in stickers, neon-colored ghosts of ownership. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, holding the rail that William had carved himself years ago. The wood was smooth from time, from his hands, from mine. But no one noticed me there. Edward walked past, wine glass in hand, talking to one of his cousins. "Dad built all this from nothing," he said proudly. "Every inch of it is proof of his genius." The cousin nodded. He really left a legacy. Edward smiled. "Now it's our turn to carry it forward." He didn't even glance at me. Someone turned up the music, a piano recording, loud and cheerful. The laughter grew louder, too. I caught bits and pieces of their conversations. "We should gut the kitchen. These curtains are so old-fashioned. Maybe turn her room into a home office." I heard Vanessa's voice from the hallway. "She's already halfway gone anyway." The words landed like a slap. There was no anger in her tone, just dismissal, as if I were a detail to be crossed off a list. I stayed quiet. I always had. A few minutes later, Vanessa appeared carrying a tray of champagne glasses. "We're celebrating Dad's legacy," she said with a bright smile. "He built an empire. Now we get to carry it forward." Someone in the group laughed. "And clean out the ghosts." They all found that funny. I stood there, still holding my coat, unsure whether to stay or leave. I thought about going upstairs to the bedroom William and I had shared for nearly 5 decades. But when I looked up, I saw a moving crew already carrying boxes down the hall. The bedroom door was wide open. My dresses hung limp from hangers. My books were piled in a box marked donation. When I walked toward them, Edward stopped me. "Mom," he said, his voice careful as if speaking to a stranger, "we've set up a room for you downstairs. It's quieter there. You'll have more privacy." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He led me to the laundry room. It smelled of bleach and damp walls. A small cot had been placed against the far corner beside the dryer. There was no pillow, just a folded blanket. "This will be temporary," he said, "until we figure things out." I wanted to ask what things meant, but I didn't. He left before I could turn around. The light in the laundry room flickered. I sat on the cot and listened to the sound of laughter above me. Through the floorboards, I could hear the muffled voices of my own family, talking about investments, vacations, who would take which house, who deserved more. Someone said, "The Lexus is already in my name." Another voice answered, "I want the scarves. Even if they're hers, she won't use them." Then came laughter, real laughter, full of comfort. I stared at the wall in front of me, cracked paint, a few old cobwebs near the window. I thought about how many times I had polished that floor, scrubbed those tiles, cooked meals for those same mouths that now mocked me. I wasn't angry, not yet. Mostly I was tired. I opened the small lunchbox one of the neighbors had left earlier. Inside was a piece of cold chicken and a spoonful of potatoes. I ate quietly. The food had no taste. Above me, Megan's voice echoed through the vent. Grandpa's office would make a great walk-in closet. They laughed again. When the music died down, I stood and looked around the room. My suitcase had been placed beside the dryer. On top of it sat a framed photo from our 30th anniversary, William with his arm around me, both of us smiling in front of the rose arbor. The glass was cracked, but the picture was still whole. I picked it up carefully and held it close. It was strange how the world could move on so quickly while mine had stopped. I thought about what Vanessa said. She's already halfway gone. Maybe that's what they wanted, for me to disappear quietly, to make space for their new life. But I wasn't gone, not even close. My fingers went to the inside pocket of my sweater. The paper was still there, slightly worn, the edges soft from years of folding. The bank memorandum, 2009. My name written clearly next to William's, not as a witness, as a co-founder. They didn't know about it. They'd never asked. Back then, when the company was falling apart, it was me who wired the money. Me who saved everything they were now calling their legacy. I unfolded the document just to make sure it was still real. It was. My signature was there in blue ink. I placed it back carefully and buttoned my pocket. The laughter upstairs started again. Glasses clinking, music playing, life going on as if I'd already faded into the walls. But in that small, cold laundry room, I finally understood something. I had spent my whole life building quietly, a house, a marriage, a business, a family, while they learned to take loudly. They thought silence meant weakness. They thought patience meant surrender. They were wrong. The room grew darker as the evening settled in. I could hear the ocean outside, faint but steady, the same sound I heard every night of my marriage. It reminded me that the tide always returns, no matter how far it goes out. I lay back on the cot, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere above, someone was still laughing. It didn't matter. I wasn't listening anymore. I pressed my hand against my pocket, felt the paper beneath the fabric. Solid, safe, mine. They could take the house. They could take the furniture. They could take the name off the mailbox. But they couldn't take what I built. Not this time. And as the laughter faded into the distance, I whispered to the quiet room, "You're wrong, Vanessa. I'm not halfway gone." I closed my eyes. I was just getting started. 15 years ago, the house was different. It still smelled like coffee in the mornings and lemon polish in the afternoons. William worked in the study late into the night, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his desk covered in papers and unpaid invoices. That was the year the numbers started slipping. First a few missed payments, then contracts falling through. The year everything we'd built together began to crumble. I remember the night it began. It was close to midnight. The rain was coming down hard, the kind that rattles the windows and fills the gutters in minutes. William was sitting in the dark, his tie undone, his hands covering his face. The only light came from the lamp on his desk. He didn't hear me walk in. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red. Not from tears, he rarely cried, but from the kind of exhaustion that seeps into a man's bones. "The bank called again," he said quietly. "They're freezing the line of credit." I didn't say anything. "They won't extend another loan without collateral," he added, voice cracking. "We're out of options." There was something about the way he said it that made me stop breathing for a second. He'd always been the one who fixed things, who stayed calm when the rest of us panicked. Seeing him like that, lost, defeated, broke something inside me. We sat in silence for a while. The clock on the wall ticked too loud. He rubbed his temples and said, "If we can't find the money by Monday, the company's gone." That night, after he went to bed, I stayed up staring at the jewelry box on my dresser. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside were pieces I'd carried through my whole life. My mother's emerald necklace, the gold bangles from our wedding, a diamond ring William had given me when Edward was born. Every piece had a story. Every piece was a part of me. I picked up the emerald necklace first. It caught the faint light from the lamp, glowing green even in the dark. My mother used to say those stones were lucky. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was their purpose, to save us now. The next morning, I went downtown before sunrise. Savannah's streets were still empty, the air cool and damp from the night's rain. The jewelry store on the corner was just opening when I arrived. The man behind the counter was old, the same one who'd sold William my wedding ring 50 years ago. He looked at me with gentle eyes. "Mrs. Harlow," he said softly, "you're up early." I placed the small velvet box on the counter and opened it. He stared at the pieces, his expression falling. "These are heirlooms," he said after a moment. You shouldn't part with them. So is survival, I told him. He nodded slowly, understanding more than I had to say. He inspected each piece carefully, weighing them, testing the stones under the bright white light. I stood there watching the reflections dance across the glass. Every glint of green and gold felt like a memory being erased. When he handed me the form to sign, I hesitated only once. I wrote my name, Marjorie Harlow, and pressed the pen hard enough to leave an imprint through the paper. The sound of his stamp hitting the receipt was final, like a door closing. He counted the bills carefully and slid them across the counter. I didn't look at the money right away. I looked at the space where the jewelry had been. The counter seemed too empty, too quiet. On my way out, he said, "You're doing the right thing." I didn't answer. I wasn't sure anymore what right meant. I went straight to the bank and wired the money to the company account. The teller asked, "Would you like to add your name to the deposit?" I shook my head. "No, it's for my husband." That afternoon, William came home late. His eyes looked brighter than they had in weeks. "We did it," he said, dropping his briefcase on the table. "We secured the investors. The company's going to survive." He didn't ask where the money came from. I didn't tell him. We stood there for a long time, both pretending we didn't know what had been sacrificed to make that happen. The next morning, he kissed me on the cheek before leaving for work. "You're my lucky charm," he said with a smile. I watched him drive away, the sun glinting off the car window, and felt a strange calm. Months passed. The business recovered. The headlines started to appear, the visionary who turned failure into fortune. William's face was everywhere, newspapers, magazines, industry panels. They called him self-made. They called him brilliant. At the celebration party, people raised glasses to him. They used words like legacy and genius and empire. No one said my name. I didn't expect them to, but the part that hurt most wasn't the silence. It was the slogan. A year later, I visited the new office for the first time. The company had grown, moved into a glass building downtown. The lobby was sleek, full of awards and framed headlines. And there, on the wall behind the reception desk, carved in gold letters, were the words, "Legacy built alone." I stared at those words for a long time. A young employee passed by and smiled politely. "Isn't it inspiring?" she said. "Yes," I replied softly, "in its own way." When I got back home, I sat in the living room, the afternoon light falling through the curtains. I thought about the necklace, the ring, the bangles, the weight they once carried, the stories they once held. They were gone now, melted into numbers on a screen, invisible in history, but I knew. I knew that every contract, every deal, every success they praised had been written with the quiet ink of sacrifice. Mine. I smiled, not with pride, but with understanding. "They built it with my silence," I whispered. And for the first time, I realized silence had a cost. One I'd already paid, in full. The laundry room wasn't meant for living. It smelled like bleach and damp towels, the air heavy with old soap. The ceiling light flickered every few seconds, buzzing like a trapped fly. In one corner stood the washing machine, still humming from a half-finished load someone had forgotten to dry. That's where my son decided I should stay. "Mom," he'd said earlier that morning, his voice soft but his tone final, "we thought you'd be more comfortable down here. It's quiet, out of the way." I didn't argue. I didn't ask why my room, my bedroom, was now being painted for someone else. They'd already moved my suitcase down before I could say anything. My clothes were folded into a plastic bin. My books were stacked on top of the dryer. The cot they gave me looked like something from a clinic. Thin mattress, no pillow, just a folded blanket and a single lamp beside it. The first night, I couldn't sleep. The house was too loud above me. Footsteps, laughter, the clink of glasses. They were hosting dinner guests again. "A toast to new beginnings," someone shouted. I lay there staring at the ceiling, watching the light flicker. I thought about all the nights I used to come down here to do laundry for them. Edward's baseball uniforms, William's shirts after long days at the office. I knew this room better than any other in the house, but I'd never imagined living in it. The next morning I decided to clean. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was dignity. I swept the floor, wiped the shelves, organized the old cleaning supplies. When I pulled out a crate from under the utility sink, I noticed a loose floorboard near the back wall. It had always creaked when I stepped on it, but I'd never thought much of it before. I knelt down and pressed it gently. The wood shifted. Beneath it was a narrow gap, just wide enough for a hand. I reached in and felt something smooth. Leather. When I pulled it out, dust rose into the air. It was an old brown folder, the edges worn, the surface marked by time. I wiped it clean with the edge of my sleeve and placed it on the small folding table. I opened it slowly. Inside were papers I hadn't seen in years, the bank memorandum, the investment agreement from 2009, and a stack of handwritten pages tied together with string. The pages were yellowed but still sharp, the ink slightly faded but readable. It was all there. The notes I'd written for the company's expansion plan. The original draft of the strategy William later called his own, the one that saved Harlow Innovations. My handwriting covered every page, neat and deliberate, each line numbered. Every idea that had been hidden, every contribution that had been erased, all in front of me again. I sat there staring at the papers, my heart beating faster than it had in years. "They think I forget," I whispered, "but I remember every line, every comma." The words came out steady, not angry, just certain. I traced my fingers along the edge of the folder. I remembered the nights I'd written those pages, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea while William slept upstairs. I remembered mailing them to the office under a false name so no one would question where they came from. And I remembered the pride in his voice when he said, "They loved it. They said it was genius." Now the same papers lay in front of me, proof that my silence had built more than I'd ever been given credit for. Upstairs, I could hear Vanessa's voice through the vent. "We'll move Mom's things to storage tomorrow," she said. "The laundry room's only temporary." Edward answered, "Yeah, she won't even notice." I smiled to myself. A small, tired smile. Oh, I noticed. I gathered the papers and placed them back into the folder. My hands were shaking, but not from weakness, from clarity. For years, I told myself that silence kept peace, that letting them believe what they wanted was easier than proving them wrong. But peace built on erasure isn't peace. It's surrender. I stood up and looked around the room again. No windows, no light except the flickering bulb above. It felt fitting somehow. The place where I'd been tucked away was the same place where the truth had been waiting all along. The folder sat on the table, small but powerful, a lifetime of evidence wrapped in leather. I reached for the phone on the wall, the old landline we'd never disconnected. My fingers hovered over the buttons. The number came to me easily, even after all these years. I dialed it slowly. 1 ring, 2, then a voice. Deep, steady, familiar. "Langford and Associates," he said. I took a breath. "Hello, Mr. Langford," I said quietly. "It's Marjorie Harlow. I think it's time we talked." There was a pause on the other end, then a calm reply. "I was wondering when you'd call." When I hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, purpose. The washing machine stopped mid-cycle, the room suddenly silent. I looked down at the folder again and pressed my hand against it. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel invisible. I felt awake. I hadn't seen Mr. Langford in almost 20 years. Back then, he used to visit the house for dinner with William. They'd talk business until midnight while I served dessert and quietly disappeared before the real conversations began. He was one of the few men I remembered as fair, the kind who actually looked people in the eye when they spoke. The law office sat downtown, in a narrow brick building that looked older than everything around it. The gold letters on the door still read Langford and Associates, though the paint had started to fade. When I stepped inside, the air smelled of leather and old paper. The receptionist looked up, surprised. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. "I called this morning," I said. "Marjorie Harlow." Her expression changed. "Of course, Mrs. Harlow. He's expecting you." The walk down the hallway felt longer than it should have. The walls were lined with framed legal certificates, photographs of business leaders, newspaper clippings about the company's old victories. I'd walked through halls like this before, always behind William, never for myself. Mr. Langford stood when I entered his office. His hair was grayer now, his frame thinner, but his eyes were the same. Calm, observant. "Marjorie," he said, voice low with surprise. "I never expected you'd walk through that door." "Neither did I said. He gestured toward a chair. I sat down, setting the leather folder on his desk. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I opened it, one careful motion at a time, like handling something fragile. The papers inside were neatly stacked, the bank memorandum, the investment contract, and the handwritten draft titled Harlow Expansion Framework. He leaned forward, scanning the pages. "I remember this," he murmured. "Your husband submitted it just before the IPO. It changed everything for them." "Yes," I said quietly. "He did." He turned to me, eyebrows slightly raised. "You're saying?" "I wrote it," I said. My voice didn't shake, though my hands did. Every word, every figure. I used the name A.L. Rowan. I sent it through the post office with no return address. Langford's eyes narrowed as he studied my face. He wasn't questioning me, he was calculating. "Do you still have proof?" I pushed the folder toward him. "Original drafts. The ink is blue, not black. That was before they digitized their proposals. You'll see my handwriting on the margins." He opened the pages carefully. The paper made a soft, dry sound as he turned each sheet. The light from the desk lamp fell across the ink, catching the faint shimmer of the old blue strokes. He paused on the third page, running his thumb along the curve of a letter. "This is your handwriting?" he asked. "Yes, I've compared it myself." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Sarah, call Dr. Bell. Tell him I need a handwriting verification. Today." While we waited, the room was silent except for the faint ticking of a wall clock. I looked out the window. The city moved like it always did. Cars, people, traffic lights changing colors. Life going on, indifferent to secrets. Dr. Bell arrived within the hour, a small man, precise in movement, polite but distant. He set up a small lamp, adjusted the light, and began examining the papers with a magnifier. "Do you mind writing a few lines for me, Mrs. Harlow?" he asked. "Of course not." Langford handed me a blank sheet of paper and his fountain pen. It felt heavier than I expected. I wrote slowly. The Harlow Expansion Framework was written by me, Marjorie L. Harlow. My hand trembled slightly, the same way it had that night 15 years ago when I wrote the first draft. Dr. Bell nodded, then compared the two sets of handwriting under the light. The lamp buzzed faintly, casting sharp shadows across the desk. Every movement sounded loud, the scrape of a pen cap, the rustle of paper, the whisper of turning pages. I closed my eyes and saw that night again. William asleep in the chair beside the fireplace, an untouched glass of whiskey by his hand, the house quiet except for the wind. I'd sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea gone cold beside me, writing with the same blue ink. My fingers were stiff from the cold, but I kept writing, line after line, until dawn broke through the curtains. I remember thinking, if this works, he'll never have to know it came from me. That was the deal I made with myself. To save him, even if it meant erasing myself. Dr. Bell's voice brought me back. "It's a match," he said, removing his glasses. "Every curve, every pressure point, every hesitation, 100% consistent." Langford nodded slowly. "Thank you, Doctor." When the door closed, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me differently now. Not as a widow, not as someone's wife, but as someone who had just stepped out of a long shadow. "Marjorie," he said softly, "this isn't revenge. It's restitution." I looked at the folder on the desk, the papers that had been my quiet confession for 15 years. "I don't want revenge," I said. "I just want the truth to have my name again." He smiled, the faintest trace of admiration in it. "Then let's make them hear you." Those words lingered in the room like a promise. He stood, walked to his filing cabinet, and pulled out a clean folder. "I'll start the paperwork. We'll need to register authorship rights under your legal name, cross-reference the company's patent filings, and—" I interrupted softly. "Do whatever you must. I trust you." He nodded. "I know." As I gathered my coat, he said, "It's strange, isn't it? The world always assumes the quiet ones have nothing to say." I met his eyes. "They assume wrong." When I stepped outside, the late afternoon sun hit the glass buildings across the street. For the first time in years, the reflection staring back at me looked like someone I recognized, someone alive. The folder was back in my hands, heavier now, but not from weight, from meaning. The city noise faded behind me as I walked to the car. My phone buzzed in my purse. Edward again, no doubt asking about dinner or money or plans for the estate. I didn't answer. For the first time in my life, I didn't owe anyone an explanation. The rain started before noon, soft at first, then steady. It rolled down the wide windows of Harlow Manor, turning the world outside into gray streaks of water and fog. Savannah Bay was barely visible through the mist. The house felt heavier on rainy days, like even the walls remembered. I was in the kitchen making tea when the phone rang. The sound startled me. Hardly anyone called the house anymore. I wiped my hands on a towel and picked up the receiver. Mrs. Harlow? Yes. This is Mr. Langford's office. The video testament from your husband has been processed and verified. The reading will take place Friday at 10 a.m. I paused. A video? Yes, ma'am. He recorded a statement before his passing. You'll be there, of course. Of course, I said softly. When I hung up, the house was silent again except for the rain and the faint ticking of the clock above the stove. I stood there for a long time staring at the phone in my hand. A video testament. William had never been a man of many words, at least not to me, but he was a man of precision. He planned everything. If he left a recording, it meant there was something he wanted to say that he couldn't in life. I carried my tea to the window and stood looking out. The rain blurred the line between sea and sky until they were one color, gray and endless. The kind of sky that makes you feel small but not afraid. He never said sorry out loud. Maybe this is how he'll do it. The thought came quietly, not with hope, not with bitterness, just truth. There had been so many things left unsaid between us, not because of anger, but because we'd both learned to live inside silence. It was easier that way. Now, even from beyond, he was still speaking through walls and lawyers and screens. I took a slow sip of tea. The warmth steadied my hands. For a moment, I let myself imagine hearing his voice again, that calm, certain tone that could make people listen. Once, it made me feel safe. Later, it made me disappear. I turned from the window and walked toward the mantel in the living room. The wedding photo was still there, the one from 1969 when we were both too young to understand what promises cost. The glass was a little dusty, the frame slightly crooked. I straightened it and touched his face. My fingers trembled, but my eyes didn't. I guess we'll see what you left behind, William, I whispered. Outside, thunder rolled far away, low and long, like a warning. I set the cup down, wiped the condensation off the window, and took one last look at the bay. Whatever was on that recording, I was ready to hear it. Not as his wife, not as someone forgotten, but as the woman who finally remembered everything. I placed my hand flat on the glass. The rain felt cold through it. My hand shook just slightly, but my eyes, they stayed bright. The night before the will reading, the house smelled of roasted meat, garlic, and wine, a feast for the living, not for the lost. I could hear the laughter before I even reached the dining room. The long mahogany table was already set, polished silverware, crystal glasses, linen napkins folded perfectly, candles flickering against the mirrored walls. It should have been a dinner for family, for love, for memory. But it wasn't. It was a dinner for the damned. Edward sat at the head of the table where William used to sit. His posture was perfect, his expression proud, the same confident smile he'd worn at the funeral. Vanessa sat beside him, her red dress bright under the chandelier, her hand resting lightly on his arm, as if claiming ownership of both the man and the moment. They were celebrating something. I wasn't sure what yet. Maybe the money they thought they'd secured. Maybe their new life without anyone to question them. When I walked in, the room went quiet for a second, just long enough for everyone to notice me. Then, as if nothing had happened, the chatter resumed. "Mom, you made it," Edward said, standing just enough to be polite. He gestured toward a seat at the far end of the table. Not near him, not near anyone, just enough to make it look like he'd included me. I sat down without a word. The food was beautiful, too beautiful. Plates arranged like magazine photos, portions too small to satisfy hunger, but just enough to feed pride. Vanessa poured wine for everyone, her bracelets clinking softly. "To Dad's empire," Edward said, raising his glass. "To the peace that comes when old ghosts fade," Vanessa added with a smile. A few people laughed. Megan, my granddaughter, looked down at her plate instead. I lifted my glass slowly, just enough to be polite. "Some ghosts feed the living," I said quietly. The room fell silent for a moment, and then someone laughed, one of Edward's business friends trying to break the tension. "Well," he said, "let's drink to that too." Glasses clinked. Laughter followed, forced but loud. Dinner went on. Stories about the company's future, new deals, vacation plans, real estate. Not one word about William as a husband, as a father, as a man. Just his empire, just numbers. Vanessa leaned forward. "Once everything is finalized tomorrow, we should start looking at new management options. Maybe rebrand the foundation, make it more modern." Edward nodded. "Yes, Dad's vision was great, but it's time we step out from his shadow." I watched them, their hands intertwined over the table, two people so certain the world belonged to them. I wondered if they even remembered the nights when William came home late, too tired to eat, and I sat by the stove waiting just to hand him a warm plate. Megan glanced at me again just briefly, her expression softer this time, uncertain. She looked like she wanted to say something but didn't. Maybe she felt something shifting under all the laughter. I cut my food into small pieces, more for something to do than to eat. The fork trembled slightly in my hand, not from weakness but from restraint. Vanessa turned to me suddenly. "You must feel proud, Mom," she said, her voice sugar-coated. "Everything Dad built is such a legacy." I met her eyes. "It's something," I said simply. She smiled, but her eyes stayed cold. "Tomorrow's going to be a big day. Closure, you know. It'll be good for all of us." Closure. That word again. They used it like it meant cleaning a room, not burying a life. I took a small sip of wine. "Yes," I said softly. "Closure can be, liberating." Edward raised his glass again. "To the next chapter," he said, smiling proudly. "To new beginnings," Vanessa echoed. I didn't join the toast. They laughed again, but I wasn't really hearing it anymore. The sound of forks against plates, glasses against glass. It all faded into a dull hum. My eyes drifted to the head of the table, where William used to sit. For a moment I could almost see him there, his calm presence, his quiet authority. He'd always said dinner was where truth came out. He wasn't wrong. The truth tonight was simple. They weren't mourning him. They were replacing him. Megan stood to refill water and accidentally brushed against my shoulder. "I'm sorry," she whispered quickly. Her voice was small, her eyes wet. I gave her a small nod. Maybe she was the only one who saw what this dinner really was. As the plates were cleared, Vanessa announced, "Tomorrow will be a new start for this family." I folded my napkin and placed it neatly beside my plate. "It will," I said quietly, "for some of us." Edward looked at me then, curious but dismissive, like he wasn't sure whether I meant it as a blessing or a warning. He didn't ask. The conversation moved on, lighter again. Real estate, the market, a new summer house. I let them talk. I let them laugh. I let them believe this was their victory. When the laughter swelled again, I slipped my hand into the pocket of my cardigan. My fingers brushed against the folded piece of paper inside. I pulled it out slowly, just enough to feel the weight of it. Clause 14C, William's final clause. The one Langford had mentioned briefly on the phone. The clause no one else knew about. It wasn't long or complicated. Just a single sentence written in William's handwriting. Any heir who speaks ill of their mother shall forfeit $1 million per word. I looked down the table, watching their smiles, their confidence, their certainty. They had no idea what was waiting for them. I folded the paper again, tucking it safely back into my pocket. My hand lingered there, warm against the fabric. "Enjoy your dinner," I said softly to no one in particular. Then I stood, excused myself, and walked toward the stairs. Behind me, the laughter started again. Too loud, too easy. They thought they were celebrating victory, but they were just eating their last meal in peace. The rain hadn't stopped since dawn. By the time I reached Langford's office, the city was wrapped in gray. The glass walls of the building shimmered with water, and the streets below looked like mirrors. My driver held an umbrella over me as I stepped out, but I didn't rush. The air was cold, sharp, and it cleared my head. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and new paper. The conference room was large, minimalist, all glass and steel, like a courtroom without a judge. A long table ran down the center, surrounded by leather chairs. Outside, rain tapped softly against the skylight, steady and rhythmic like a heartbeat. Edward was already there. He stood near the window, hands in his pockets, talking quietly to Vanessa. She wore dark lipstick and a diamond brooch that used to be mine. Her eyes flicked toward me, polite but empty. Edward turned, his expression carefully neutral. "Mom," he said, nodding once, "you look well." "Well enough," I replied. Megan sat near the corner, her shoulders slightly hunched, phone in her lap. She didn't look up. The others, cousins, distant relatives, a few lawyers, murmured greetings that meant nothing. Mr. Langford entered a few minutes later, carrying his black briefcase. His movements were slow, deliberate. The room quieted immediately. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm. "We're here to execute the final testament of Mr. William Harlow." He set the briefcase down, clicked it open, and began arranging papers on the table. The clock on the wall ticked softly. The rain outside grew heavier, pattering against the glass ceiling. Langford poured himself an espresso from the small tray near the wall. The hiss of steam filled the silence. He took a sip, set the cup down, and looked around the table. "Before we begin," he said, "I should note that Mr. Harlow made some revisions to his will shortly before his passing. Those revisions are legally binding and will be read today." Edward straightened, curious but confident. "Of course," he said. Vanessa smiled faintly. "I'm sure Dad had everything sorted." Langford nodded once. Then he reached into his briefcase and took out a small silver recorder. It was old-fashioned, heavy with a single blinking light. He placed it on the table and pressed play. The room filled with static, a brief hiss, then a voice. William's voice. Older, rougher, but unmistakably his. "If my son ever speaks ill of his mother," he said, his tone calm, steady, "deduct $1 million per word." For a moment no one moved. The sound of rain against the glass became louder, like applause for a truth long delayed. Edward's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. Vanessa blinked, confused. Someone near the back whispered, "What did he say?" Langford pressed a button and the playback continued. "You know how many words he's spoken," William's voice went on. "You know how many he owes." Then the tape clicked off. Silence. The air in the room seemed to tighten. Edward laughed once, short, sharp, nervous. "That's ridiculous," he said. "It's a joke. It's not—" Langford raised one hand to stop him. "It's not a joke, Mr. Harlow. It's a legally included clause, Clause 14C, signed and notarized. And, as per the instructions of your father, it comes with evidence." He opened a thick folder marked Exhibit A and slid a set of printed transcripts across the table. "These," he said, "are verified voice recordings from the home's internal surveillance system, collected within the last month of Mr. Harlow's life." Edward frowned. "You're kidding." "I don't kid about evidence," Langford replied. He adjusted his glasses and began to read from the top sheet. His voice was slow, clear, deliberate. "She's half dead already." Langford looked up. "That's one." He turned the page. "Let her rot with her memories." He paused again. "That's two." A murmur rippled through the room. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably, her hand tightening on Edward's arm. Langford continued. "She built soup. Dad built an empire. She doesn't even know what year it is. We should just put her in the garden shed." With each line, his voice stayed steady, professional, but the air in the room grew heavier. He flipped the page, reading the next lines quietly. "If we forward her pension checks, can we keep the money? She's just taking up space." Langford set the page down and looked up. "That brings the total to 88 words, Mr. Harlow. At $1 million per word, your inheritance will be reduced by $88 million. The only sound was the ticking of the clock and the faint drip of rain from the skylight. Edward stood slowly. "This is insane. You can't—" Langford interrupted, calm as ever. "I can, and I am required to. The clause is clear. The evidence is clear. The penalty stands." Vanessa tried to speak, but her voice cracked. "William wouldn't do this. He loved his son." Langford turned his gaze toward her. "He also loved his wife. And he made that clear in this will, Mrs. Harlow." Edward slammed his hand on the table. "This isn't real?" Langford opened another file. "The documentation, timestamps, and voice verification have been cross-checked by a forensic team. It is very real." Megan finally looked up from her lap. Her face was pale. "Dad? Is it true?" she whispered. Edward didn't answer. His jaw clenched, his eyes darted toward me. I hadn't said a single word. I sat there, hands folded neatly in my lap, the same way I had at the funeral, at the dinner, at every table where my silence made them comfortable. But not today. Today, my silence was the loudest voice in the room. Langford closed the folder and clasped his hands. "As of this moment," he said, "Mr. Edward Harlow's adjusted inheritance equals $4 million, reduced from 92. The numbers landed like stones on a marble floor, sharp, echoing, undeniable. Edward's face went white, his breathing quickened. "You can't just— my father wouldn't— he didn't mean—" Langford looked directly at him. "He meant every word. He signed it with yours in mind." The rain outside grew heavier, drowning out the sound of his protest. Vanessa put a hand on his arm, but he pulled away. "This is manipulation," he said, turning toward me now. "You had something to do with this, didn't you?" I met his eyes. "No," I said softly. "Your father did." He opened his mouth to argue, but Langford spoke again, his tone final. "The will has been executed according to Mr. Harlow's written and recorded instructions. If you wish to contest, you may file in court, though I'd advise against it. Every recording will be played again in public." The words hit him harder than the numbers. He sank back into his chair, silent now. Langford took another sip of his espresso. "Now," he said, "shall we proceed to the next section?" No one answered. I could feel every heartbeat in the room, mine, his, Megan's, even Vanessa's, fast and uneven. The air was thick, unmoving. Langford turned to me. "Mrs. Harlow," he said gently, "would you like to hear the rest?" I nodded. "Yes." Edward looked at me again, his face a mix of confusion and disbelief. "You knew," he said under his breath. "I remembered," I replied. Langford closed the file, locking it with a small metal clasp. "Then that concludes Clause 14C. The rest," he said, his tone quiet but sharp, "belongs to your mother." I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply sat back in my chair, watching as the truth settled in around them like dust after a storm. Outside, thunder rolled once, deep and final. Langford gathered the papers into his briefcase, the sound of each sheet sliding neatly together. "You owe your father $88 million, Edward," he said, standing, "and perhaps something far greater than that." No one moved. I looked toward the rain streaking down the glass walls. For the first time, I could see my reflection clearly in it, steady, unshaken. He built an empire with my silence, and now that silence had spoken louder than anyone in the room. The silence after Clause 14C lingered like smoke in the air, thick, uneasy, impossible to ignore. No one spoke. The only sound was the rain still tapping against the glass walls of Langford's office, a steady rhythm that felt like time itself refusing to stop. Langford stood again, adjusting his glasses. His voice was calm, but the weight of it carried across the table. "There is one more matter," he said. "Something your father asked to be included under intellectual property and authorship rights." Edward looked up, dazed. "What does that even mean?" Langford didn't answer. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a second folder, thicker, sealed with a red ribbon, and placed it in the center of the table. "This," he said, "pertains to the founding documents of Harlow Innovations, specifically the proposal that led to the company's IPO 15 years ago, the document known as the Harlow Expansion Framework." Edward blinked, trying to process the words. "That was Dad's." Langford's gaze shifted toward me. "Was it?" He untied the ribbon, opened the folder, and took out several sheets of paper. The edges were yellowed, the ink faintly blue. Then he turned to the large monitor on the wall and clicked play on a short video file. The screen came to life with the image of a forensic expert, Dr. Bell, seated under bright light, a magnifying device beside him. His voice, though calm, was clinical. Handwriting analysis between the original drafts and new samples taken from Mrs. Marjorie Harlow show a 100% match in pressure, form, and composition. The author of the document, signed A.L. Rowan, is without question Mrs. Harlow. Gasps rippled through the room. Vanessa's hand flew to her mouth. Megan froze mid-breath. Edward's face went blank. Langford closed the video and looked directly at my son. His voice softened, but only slightly. "A.L. Rowan," he said quietly, "was your mother." No one moved. For a moment, the only thing anyone could hear was the rain. Edward finally spoke, his voice shaking. "That's impossible. She made soup." Langford's eyes didn't waver. "And saved your father's legacy." He turned to another envelope in the folder, removing a single handwritten letter. The paper was cream-colored, the ink still dark. He held it up gently. "Your father left this," he said. "A personal note, sealed and notarized. He asked that it be read aloud only if the truth ever came into question." Langford unfolded it and began to read. "She found the cure before the world knew it was broken. I built a name, but she built the foundation. She kept quiet so I could stand tall. I asked her to let me take the credit because the board wouldn't follow a woman. But I knew. I always knew. This company, this family, carries her mind on every page, every patent, every success. She is the reason we Survived. The words landed like thunder, quiet but impossible to ignore. Vanessa looked away, her face pale. Megan's eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. But Edward just sat there, jaw tight, knuckles white against the table. He whispered almost to himself, "No, no, she couldn't have." Langford looked at me, then back at him. "Your mother's handwriting appears not only on the drafts, but in the margin notes of your father's presentation files, financial sheets, and early investor pitches. She wrote them, Edward. She wrote the plan that kept your family alive." Edward's voice cracked. "She was a housewife." I finally spoke. My voice was calm, not angry, not trembling. I was a woman who knew how to fix things. He turned toward me, eyes wide, confused, wounded. "You hid this from us?" "I wasn't hiding," I said. "I was helping. You just never thought to ask who I really was." Langford placed the letter gently on the table next to the signed memorandum. "Your father wanted this known," he said. "He wanted her name restored to every document tied to the IPO, every profit, every patent, every royalty check. They now fall under Mrs. Harlow's name, legally and irrevocably." The sound of his words filled the room like air after a long suffocation. Edward shook his head slowly. "You're telling me she owns the company?" Langford nodded. "She owns the legacy. The company was never yours to inherit. It was hers to begin with." The rain outside grew heavier, beating against the skylight. The light flickered slightly, reflecting on the silver coffee tray near the wall. It was almost beautiful. This strange, quiet justice delivered by facts, not anger. Edward's voice rose, desperate now. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I looked at him, really looked at him. The same boy who once held my hand at the park, who cried when his kite got caught in the oak tree. "Because," I said softly, "I thought love meant silence. I thought letting your father shine was enough. But silence can be mistaken for absence." He opened his mouth again, but I raised a hand. "And when you started to believe I was nothing, I realized I had become what I allowed. Invisible." Langford watched quietly, saying nothing. The others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The truth had filled every corner of the room. There was nowhere left to hide. My eyes went to the papers, my handwriting, the blue ink, the notes I'd written long after midnight 15 years ago. I could still see myself at that kitchen table, pen in hand, the light of the lamp turning the ink a soft blue glow. My fingers had cramped from writing, my body cold from sitting so long. But I didn't stop. Not until it was perfect. That image came back to me now. That woman in her quiet kitchen, saving an empire she would never be thanked for. I looked back at Edward. His face was pale, the weight of realization pressing down. "You buried me while I was still thinking," I said softly. "And that was your first mistake." He didn't answer. He couldn't. Langford gathered the documents, sliding them neatly back into the folder. "Everything here is verified and recorded," he said. "Mrs. Harlow, we'll proceed with transferring the rights in your name." "Thank you," I said quietly. As I stood, I noticed the rain had started to slow. Sunlight began to break through the gray, faint and thin, but real. It glinted on the edge of the glass wall, scattering reflections across the table. I picked up William's letter, folded it carefully, and slipped it into my purse. The silence in the room was no longer heavy. It was honest. I turned toward the door, pausing once. "You were right about one thing, Edward," I said. "I did build soup, but it fed more than you ever understood." Then I walked out, leaving them with the truth, written, signed, and inked in my name. The rain had started again. Not the soft kind that whispers on windows, but the heavy kind. The kind that pounds against glass and makes the world outside disappear. Inside Langford's office, the sound was like a drumbeat under the silence. Langford stood at the head of the table, his hands resting on a thick folder embossed with gold lettering. The final documents. The verdict of everything that had come before. Edward sat slumped in his chair, pale, motionless, eyes fixed on the floor. Vanessa sat beside him, her face tight, lips pressed into a thin line that trembled with fury. Megan was in the corner again, hands clasped in her lap, staring down, tears welling but unspilled. Langford cleared his throat. The rain filled the pause between his words. After review of all evidence, the verified audio, the video testimony, the handwriting analysis, and the notarized letters, The court recognizes Mrs. Marjorie L. Harlow as co-founder and intellectual property holder of all major assets associated with Harlow Innovations. He paused, his eyes moving to me. In accordance with the signed and witnessed documents of Mr. William Harlow, all remaining estate holdings, royalties, patents, and equity are to be transferred solely to Mrs. Harlow. The words landed like the sound of thunder rolling over the bay. Vanessa shot to her feet. "This is insane," she cried. "She tricked him. She must have—" I looked at her, my voice calm but firm. "No," I reminded him of the truth. Her eyes flashed. "You've been planning this." I shook my head. No one plans to be forgotten, but I learned how to stop it. Langford didn't look up from his notes. "Mrs. Harlow is correct. Every document, every clause, every recording supports her claim. There was no manipulation. Mrs. Harlow simply remembered what everyone else preferred to forget." He glanced at Edward. "Your father's final clause, Clause 14C, and his revisions were not punishment, Mr. Harlow. They were a protection. For the legacy your mother built." Edward said nothing. His jaw worked, but no sound came. Langford continued, his tone steady. "As a result of these findings, all inheritance claims under your name are hereby nullified. The revised estate plan transfers ownership of Harlow Manor, all company shares, and intellectual properties to your mother, effective immediately." The rain hit harder now, a percussion against glass. Vanessa let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You can't just erase everything. We built this life." Langford looked at her then, his expression as sharp as his voice was calm. "The law," he said, "remembers what people forget." Vanessa's face went red. "This is theft." Langford closed the folder with a soft, deliberate sound. "No, this is restitution." The word hung in the air, heavy and final. Edward finally lifted his head. His eyes were red. "Dad wouldn't have wanted this," he said, his voice breaking. I met his gaze. "Your father wanted peace, but peace without truth isn't peace, Edward. It's silence, and I lived that silence long enough." He swallowed hard, looking down again. The weight of years, his pride, his blindness, pressed on his shoulders like iron. Langford began to pack his briefcase. "Mrs. Harlow," he said, glancing toward me, "you'll receive the final transfer documents this evening. The court will file them by morning." "Thank you," I said quietly. He nodded once. "Your husband was a complicated man, but he left a clear wish, that the woman who saved his empire would finally own it." The room fell quiet again, except for the rain. Vanessa stood, grabbing her bag. "Come on, Edward," she said sharply. "We're leaving." He didn't move. "Edward," she snapped. He looked at me instead. For a second I saw the boy he used to be, the one who once built sandcastles by the bay, the one who used to ask me if ghosts were real. "They are," I said softly, almost to myself. "And some ghosts never stop feeding the living." He turned away silent and walked out. Vanessa followed, her heels clicking across the tile like breaking glass. Langford remained for a moment longer, adjusting his coat. He looked at me with quiet respect. "Justice doesn't always shout, Mrs. Harlow," he said. "Sometimes it whispers through the right hands." I smiled faintly. "Then I suppose we both heard it today." He nodded once, then left, closing the glass door behind him. The rain drummed louder. The office was empty now, except for me and the documents on the table. The light above flickered once, reflecting against the polished steel of the chair beside me. Among the scattered papers, something caught my eye. A small silver band lying near the edge of the table. My wedding ring. I hadn't worn it since the funeral. I must have taken it off that morning without thinking. I picked it up slowly. The metal was cool against my skin, familiar and foreign all at once. I turned it in my fingers, watching the faint scratches catch the light. For 50 years, that ring meant belonging. Now, it meant memory. I slipped it back onto my finger. Outside, thunder rolled again. Distant, tired, final. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a ghost in my own story. I felt alive, steady, and seen. William's voice echoed softly in my mind. "You always knew how to fix things." And this time, I had. 48 hours later, Harlow Manor no longer sounded like a home. The laughter was gone. The music was gone. All that remained were the echoes, the thud of boxes closing, the scrape of tape pulled across cardboard, the hollow sound of things being undone, Rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of it, clean and metallic like something washed new. Megan was in the hallway, quietly wrapping china in old newspaper. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost careful, as if each piece carried more than glass and dust, as if she understood now what they were leaving behind. Edward sat on the floor of the living room, elbows on his knees, his head bowed. Around him were half-filled boxes, old photo frames, and a few torn post-it notes. "This one's mine," written in bright colors now fading. He didn't move. He didn't speak. I walked through the house one last time. The footsteps echoed differently now. Lighter somehow. Freer. The study, where William once stayed up until dawn drafting deals, was empty. Only the indent of his chair remained on the carpet. I ran my hand over the desk, tracing the grooves where his pen had pressed too hard. There was still a faint scent of his cologne in the air, cedar and tobacco, the kind that lingered on the cuffs of his suits. The guest room, once promised to be a spa, was stripped bare. The mirrors were gone. The laughter that once filled it, careless, cruel, was gone too. Then I reached Edward's room. It was smaller than I remembered. Or maybe it just looked smaller now that everything inside had been taken out. The trophies, the books, the old guitar he never learned to play. The walls were pale where pictures had hung for years. I stood at the doorway, and for a moment I could almost hear the boy he'd once been, the one who used to run down the hall calling my name. But the man sitting downstairs wasn't that boy anymore. When I opened the door to my old room, the light startled me. They'd taken down the heavy curtains, letting the sunlight pour in through the tall windows. It filled every corner, even the dark ones. The air was warm, alive, golden. For the first time in years, the room didn't feel like a cage. It felt like mine again. Edward's voice came from behind me, low and rough. "Please, Mom." I turned. He stood in the doorway, eyes red, face hollow. He looked older, not from time, but from truth. His hands shook slightly. "I didn't know," he said. "About the papers, about Dad, about you." I nodded once. "I know." He took a step forward. "Can't we start over?" My answer came gently, not cruelly. "You spoke first," I said. The will simply listened. He closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek, and I knew he finally understood. Not the money, not the punishment, but the cost of his words. Megan appeared behind him, carrying a small box. "I'll drive him," she said quietly. Her voice trembled, but her eyes met mine. Steady, remorseful, kind. "Take care of yourself," I told her. She nodded. "You too, Grandma." And then they were gone. The front door shut softly. The sound echoed down the hallway, final but not cruel. I stood in the middle of the foyer. The chandelier above cast small diamonds of light across the marble floor. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds, spilling through the tall windows in long, golden stripes. Dust floated in the air, glowing. For a long moment, I didn't move. This was the same house where I'd been dismissed, silenced, erased, and now it stood empty, quiet, and honest. I wasn't angry anymore, just free. On the table near the door sat a small wooden box. Inside was my wedding ring. I'd left it there days ago. I picked it up again, held it between my fingers, and slipped it back on. The metal was warm now, alive against my skin. The ring didn't mean belonging anymore. It meant survival. I walked toward the center of the grand hall and stopped beneath the skylight. The light poured down, soft and wide, wrapping around me like a slow breath. No applause, no audience, just silence and light. The camera would pull back now, slow, steady, the figure of an old woman standing alone in the house that finally remembered her name. No anger, no need to prove anything. Just Marjorie Harlow, standing tall, unbroken, and finally seen. The house was quiet again. Not empty, not dead, just quiet in a way that felt right. The kind of quiet that comes after a long storm, when even the walls seem to exhale. Sunlight poured in through the wide windows, golden and gentle. Dust floated in the air, catching the light like slow-moving stars. I started at the end of the hallway, the same hallway that once echoed with footsteps, laughter, and arguments. Now, only my own footsteps filled it. One by one, I began to peel them away. The stickers. The first was on the old rocking chair by the window. A bright green square, wrinkled at the edges, the words written in Megan's handwriting. "This one's mine." I pressed my fingers to it before pulling it off. The paper left a faint mark behind, a small patch of lighter wood. I ran my hand over the smooth curve of the chair, remembering the nights I used to sit there, holding Edward when he was still small enough to fit in my arms. He'd fall asleep against my shoulder, his tiny breath warm against my neck. William used to tease me, said I rocked too fast, like I was trying to outpace time. I smiled at the memory. Then, quietly, I said, "That one was never anyone's to claim." The next sticker was on the grandfather clock in the hallway. The paper was bright yellow, crooked, half torn. The clock hadn't worked in years, but the pendulum still moved faintly when the floorboards creaked. I touched it lightly, listening to the faint echo of its old rhythm. Tick, tock. I could still hear William's laugh. Deep, warm, the sound that once filled this house. He used to set the clock 5 minutes fast so we'd never be late for life, he said. We were late for a lot of things anyway, but never love. Not in the beginning. I peeled the sticker off, slow and careful. The glue pulled away with a soft hiss. The clock made one last sound, a single tired chime. "That one," I whispered, was his laughter. Further down the hall stood the piano. It was covered with a thin layer of dust, but the keys still shone faintly in the light. A pink sticker clung to the lid, written in Vanessa's sharp, perfect handwriting. Mine. I sat on the bench, ran my fingers across the keys. They were cool under my skin. The sound that came out was uneven, hesitant, but it was music. I closed my eyes and let the memory take over. William beside me, his voice humming low as his fingers found the melody. Autumn leaves. It had always been his song. The notes rose like soft wind, then fell like rain. I pressed one key, then another, the sound echoing faintly through the empty house. The air trembled with it, real, fragile, alive. Flashback and present blurred together, William laughing, me scolding him for playing too loud, Edward running through the room with a toy plane. The piano had held all of it, joy, noise, silence, time. When the song faded, I peeled the last pink sticker off and placed it gently in my palm. I looked at it for a moment, then let it go. The paper floated to the floor like a falling leaf. I stood and looked around the room. The light was softer now, turning orange as the sun began to set. The shadows stretched long and thin across the wooden floors. Every corner of the house seemed to breathe again, as if it had been waiting for this moment, for the claiming to end and the remembering to begin. I walked back through the hall, peeling the last few stickers along the way. The blue one on the dresser, the yellow one on the lamp, the small green one on the photo frame. Each one came away easily now, as if they, too, had been waiting to let go. When I reached the piano again, I stopped. There, tucked between two keys, was one final sticker, smaller than the rest, faded almost white. I hadn't noticed it before. I bent down, squinting. The handwriting was faint but familiar. Williams. From years ago, maybe when he was testing ink or marking something for repair. Just 3 words, half smudged but clear enough to read. "This one's mine." My breath caught. I sat down again, ran my hand over the lid, feeling the grooves, the scratches, the ghosts of songs that once filled the house. For a moment the sunlight hit just right, bouncing off the polished surface, scattering tiny golden reflections across the room. I smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't come from happiness but from peace. I whispered, that one was always his. The camera would linger there, the woman, the piano, the last sticker, the golden light. The music of autumn leaves faintly playing somewhere in memory, echoing through walls that no longer hold resentment, only time. The house, once filled with noise, now filled with grace. A year had passed. The world had softened around the edges. My new home sat on the edge of Savannah Bay, where the waves rolled in slow and steady, never rushing, never stopping. The mornings here smelled of salt and coffee, and the afternoons filled with light so bright it felt almost forgiving. The apartment was simple, white curtains that swayed with the sea breeze, a wooden table near the window, and shelves lined with books instead of memories. No chandeliers, no portraits, no ghosts, just space. Every morning I sat at that table with a cup of tea and my notebook. The ocean stretched beyond the glass like a moving painting. The rhythm of the waves was enough, the royalties still arrived. Checks with numbers that no longer meant much. I didn't need the money. I never did. I needed my name back. And now I had it, not as revenge, but as restoration. That was when I founded the Silent Architects Foundation. A small office, a handful of volunteers, one clear mission: to give voice and credit to the women who had built in silence. Scientists, writers, engineers, artists, women whose work had been signed by others, whose minds had been footnotes in the histories they authored. The first scholarship went to a young woman from Georgia Tech. Her name was Lydia Cruz, 23, thin and sharp-eyed, hands always moving when she spoke. She had designed a renewable energy prototype, but nearly lost credit when her supervisor tried to file the patent in his own name. When she came to collect her grant, she stood in front of my desk, holding the folder to her chest. Her voice trembled when she spoke. "Your story saved mine," she said. I smiled. "Then use your voice. Don't wait for anyone to hand it back." She nodded, eyes wet, and I saw a reflection of my younger self in her, quiet, capable, underestimated. After she left, I sat back and looked out at the sea. The light was shifting, turning gold as evening settled over the bay. The sound of the waves grew softer, slower, as if the whole world had learned to breathe again. On the desk beside me lay a stack of letters, women from across the country writing to say thank you, to share their stories. Some were scientists, some were teachers, some were just mothers who'd built lives out of love and labor that no one ever named. One of them had written, "You reminded me that silence doesn't erase us. It only waits for the right moment to be heard." I traced the words with my fingers. They understood. I picked up my pen and began to write another letter. Not for anyone specific, just for the record, for the quiet. "Dear William, the royalties still arrive. I never needed the money. I needed my name back. I hope you see what it became, not an empire, but a bridge. Not revenge, but remembrance." I paused, looking out at the horizon. The sea reflected the sunset now, bands of gold and copper stretching across the water. For a moment, I thought of him, the man who once said, "You always knew how to fix things." Maybe this was what he meant. The wind picked up, brushing through the open window. The curtains swayed white against the dimming sky. The paper on my desk fluttered, the edges lifting as if the sea itself wanted to read what I'd written. I smiled, not because of joy, but because of peace, the kind that comes when everything that needed to be said has finally been heard. I stood, walked to the window, and pushed it open wider. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of salt and jasmine. The unfinished page on the desk rustled once more, then caught the wind, lifting, spinning, floating out through the window. It drifted upward, carried by the sea breeze, glinting in the last light of the day, a single white page dancing above the waves before disappearing into the horizon. I watched it go, the sound of the tide beneath it, the hum of the world around it, and for the first time in my life I didn't feel erased. I felt written. Morning came quietly. The first light over Savannah Bay painted everything in soft gold. The waves, the windows, the garden beyond the porch. The air smelled of salt and lilac. Marjorie Harlow stepped outside barefoot, the wood of the deck cool beneath her feet. In her hands was a small tin watering can, rusted at the handle but still strong, the same one she'd brought with her from Harlow Manor. The garden was small, just a narrow stretch of soil along the fence, but it held something precious. A lilac bush, newly rooted, its branches trembling gently in the morning breeze. The petals had opened overnight, pale lavender, almost silver in the dawn light. She knelt down slowly, knees pressing into the damp earth, and began to water the roots. The sound of the water was soft, rhythmic, like the whisper of the tide. The sunlight caught the droplets as they fell, scattering tiny rainbows across the leaves. It was the same lilac she had once planted by the porch at Harlow Manor, the same one that had been cut down years ago when the family decided they needed space. She had taken a small root from it before selling the house. Now it bloomed again, stronger, freer. She smiled. From inside the house, the sound of the old clock chimed, one she'd repaired herself. She looked up toward the open window. The curtains swayed gently in the sea wind, white and weightless like breath. Her voice came quietly, steady, filled with memory. "They thought I was fading. I was just thinking." She straightened slowly, wiped her hands on her apron, and stood watching the lilac sway in the wind. The light caught her face, soft wrinkles, calm eyes, the quiet strength of someone who had carried storms and survived them. Behind her, on the front wall of the cottage, hung a wooden sign, carved by hand from the old oak that once stood in Harlow Manor's garden. The letters were deep and clean, the words simple. This house was funded by a burden. Enjoy the silence. The breeze picked up again, carrying the scent of salt and lilac through the air. She tilted her head toward the sky, eyes half closed, and listened. No shouting, no ticking clocks, no ghosts. Just the sound of the sea, the wind, and life continuing, quiet, whole, and her own. The camera would pull back slowly now, the frame widening, the garden, the house, the curve of the bay in the distance. The lilacs shimmered under the sun, the petals glowing like fragments of memory, the color of forgiveness. Her voice returned one last time, softer, almost like a thought carried on the wind. Some of us were never silent. We were simply waiting to be heard. The waves rose and fell, the light spread across the garden, and then,